I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Her name is Farida. She came from the United Kingdom and she's professor of Manchester Metropolitan University. Farida was trained to be horse whisperer, so she used to talk to horses, right? But you will not be talking today about this, unfortunately. Okay, please welcome Farida.
Thank you. So what I want to talk about is some media literacy strategies that we've developed in the Visual Social Media Lab and how we've done that in terms of different countries and both short-term and long-term strategies. Okay, so one of the things that is really key to us, the name suggests this already, is that we're really interested in images. But when it comes to mis and disinformation, images are key and very powerful vehicles of mis and disinformation. And in part, that is because they are able to trigger emotional responses, and they are far more persuasive than other forms of communication. And it's because of this that they become such powerful vehicles of mis and disinformation. And what we have seen across the world, both in the run-up to elections and in the aftermath of elections, in the aftermath of crises as well, is that a lot of mis and disinformation stories are image-led. Now, the other thing that's really important about images is that they're also the lifeblood of politics, right? So politicians, especially in the run-up to elections, will use images in all sorts of different ways, both misleading. Opponents will use images to discredit their political, opponents. And here are just a number of examples of this. And one of the things that I think is really, really important is within the context now of mis and disinformation, where images are so central, we also need to understand images in general. So what is the role of images in general in politics? Not just mis and disinformation, but how can we become more literate in understanding images in politics? So another thing that's very important is to see this really on a spectrum. So what does this kind of visual culture around images and politics look like? And one way to describe that is to say the image of Nigel Farage using a very misleading way to talk about the refugee crisis and to suggest that refugees were on their way to the UK is potentially business as usual, right? Politicians, and I'm sure this is also very much true here, have always relied on using misleading images to sway the population and to get votes. Then we have the use of images as part of disinformation campaigns, right? So this is a relatively new phenomenon in the way that we're describing it now, but in many ways there's nothing new about this either. What is new is this phenomenon around deepfake videos. So these are hyper-realistic videos that use AI technology and are seen as a kind of next frontier of information warfare. But all of this exists within an online space that is about images and politics. Now, another way of describing this is a spectrum that takes you from low-tech to really high-end kind of manipulation techniques. Now, one of the things that I think is really, really important to stress here, that as much as there is hype and concern around the deep fakes, it's this stuff that you really want to worry about. It's the images that are presented out of context, it's the low-tech videos that are presented in a misleading context, and because they're images, because they're videos, they're exceptionally persuasive. And the countries where this plays an especially important role is those that have low levels of literacy, where a lot of the communication is visible and a lot of the communication will be in closed networks like WhatsApp. This is where you have huge, huge problems. And a country that's often highlighted in this context is India. So what we have is a huge amount of panic around deep fakes. But what we really should be panicking about is the low-tech stuff, is the still images that are not altered, but are presented in misleading context. So, in terms of policy responses, and I'm just focusing here on the UK and the EU, there's been a lot of inquiries, a lot of report writing, there's lots and lots of stuff that has been churned out. And one of the things when you look at these reports is that, of course, they're, trying to address this problem, and they're presenting, so this is from the European Commission, they're presenting mis and disinformation as a multifaceted problem, but they don't look at images, right? In the UK context, this is a report from the House of Commons, images are seen as a related problem, but there's no discussion of them. So what we would argue is, if you don't fully understand the problem, how can you have a solution, right? Or how can you have comprehensive solutions if this central content form is not being taken seriously? And I'm pleased to see a lot of nodding in the audience, because when I give these talks, people intuitively, immediately understand that we're dealing with an online visual sphere where all of this stuff is swirling around. And if the visual piece is not being taken more seriously, you're just not going to be able to find the most effective solutions. So one of the responses that we've had to this is that we teamed up with First Draft, and we worked with Claire Wardle on a relatively small-scale project to look at the way in which images were being used in misleading ways in the UK and French elections in 2017. And we looked at 95 stories, image-led stories in detail, and one of the key findings that we found is that nearly 30% of these presented images with a false context. And what is even more alarming about this, when we talk about the spectrum of low-tech versus high-tech, is that these were unaltered images, right? So these were photographs, most of the time, that had not been photoshopped, that had not been changed in any way. The only thing that had been done is they were presented in a misleading context. So what you see here is the mobilization of false context with a real image, right? So one of the responses that we had when we worked with journalists is to develop a framework that allowed journalists to specifically deal with images and with video. So with photographs and with video. And the idea of this framework is that you place the piece of content that you want to question. So you place the video or the photograph in the middle of the framework, and you go around answering these 20 questions. So these original 20 questions are applicable to any social media image. And then the questions in color are specifically around mis and disinformation. So to give people additional prompts, what are some of the things you might want to look at for these images in relation to mis and disinformation? Now, the thing that we hadn't banked on, so we launched this last year, is that this had enormous potential in terms of media literacy. And this was not our audience. This was not something that we had thought about. But when people were coming up to us and saying, there are no frameworks in media literacy specifically to deal with social media images, we got very excited. And we thought, well, let us help. Let's come up with projects. Let's think about how we can translate this for a younger demographic. And one of the things about a younger demographic is that there is an ongoing assumption that so-called digitally native young people are really good at understanding this stuff and are really good at debunking information online. And what research is showing time and time again is that that actually isn't the case. And there's a really good report that came out last year, Fake News and Critical Literacy, in the UK, that underscores that very much. Now, the other thing that's important about this is to talk about the older generations in terms of who is actually sharing this content. And again, research is increasingly showing that it's older generations that are struggling potentially more so, but are more likely to share this, and very problematically, of course, in democratic societies, are the ones who are voting. So the impact of all of this stuff has genuine consequences in terms of voting behavior. So if this isn't clear already, what we are advocating is to create a special space for visual media literacy, and to say that that is different from digital literacy, news literacy, general media literacy, information literacy, critical literacy, And it can sit side by side, but what we need is a recognition that the online landscape is largely visual. And everybody understands and knows that, but I don't think we have responses that are capable of dealing with that. And that is the space that we occupy. So one of the things that we did is we teamed up with an organization in Canada called Civics, and they are a non-partisan NGO dedicated to building the skills and habits of active and engaged citizenship among young Canadians. So they specifically work with young Canadians. They have a project called Student Vote, where they're teaching kids about the voting process. So we worked with them, and very much in connection to the upcoming elections, which are happening on Monday in Canada. So they have an already existing program, Student Vote, and we tapped into that to try and address this issue around images. So what we did is we worked with teachers and we translated our framework, which is quite complex, to a much more digestible framework that could be taught in primary schools. And that's what we came up with. We also gave it a different name. So the framework, as it stands now in the Canadian context, is called Questioning Images. And we built a whole set of resources around it. So we have a standalone 1-hour lesson, which has worksheets, it has example images that people can work through with all the answers, it has videos, it has a whole kind of suite of resources built out from the framework. And one of the things that's really fantastic about Civics is the way in which they train their teachers. So they organize these things called boot camps, where they bring together, groups of people like we have here today, and they expose them to the most cutting-edge research in the kind of literacy space. And so I've been going to these boot camps since the beginning of the year to train these teachers together with civic staff. And so up until May, we trained over 500 teachers, many more now, because they've had more boot camps in the run-up to the elections. And we have some information from exit surveys. So we have nearly 400 completed exit surveys following these boot camps. And one of the things that has been really, really positive is just how enthusiastic the teachers were about this resource. So we exposed them to it, and then we wanted to know, would you use it? What are the things that you would change about it? And 97% said that they would absolutely use it, with a further 2.7%. So nearly 100% of people said that essentially they would use it. So we had a really, really positive response to this. So fast forward to this being rolled out at scale. So it's now in 9,000 schools. That covers 70% of all schools in Canada. So this now has the potential to reach potentially 1 million young Canadians, or up to 1 million young Canadians in the run-up to Monday's election. And it's also been officially endorsed by Election Canada. We didn't stop there. Civics was also running a similar project in Colombia. And again, I went to Bogota to work with teachers there to translate the resource as part of Foto Estudiantil, their project in Colombia. And so the resource has now also been translated into Spanish and has now been sent out to 200 schools. So one of the things that we haven't been able to do yet is to understand what is the impact of these resources, what has happened in terms of people using it, right? And so that's one of the things that we want to do next, and we also want that to inform the next phase of our research project. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to interview the teachers. What we want to know is, how did you use it? If you didn't use it, why didn't you use it? We just want to do reflective interviews with teachers. And one of the issues in terms of kind of limitations, and as an academic, I'm all about the limitations, is we can't talk to the students. That's very, very complex in the Canadian context. And also, we have no baseline. right? So we don't know what we're measuring against because that wasn't measured. So we don't know what were the skills that the students had before this intervention. And the only way in which we're going to find out something about the intervention is speaking to the teachers. So we recognize that there are limitations, but that's the best we can do under the current circumstances. So trying to rectify some of that, on a much smaller scale, we're rolling out a project in the UK, working with 3 schools in Manchester, which is where I'm based, to work on a much more comprehensive 6-week intervention, where students will be exposed to, per year, so in the UK we have different year groups, going from year 1 to year 6, where they will each year get 6 hours of visual media literacy training. So if that student stays with that school, by the end of their year 6 project, they will have had 36 hours over 6 years of this intervention. I mean, that's the dream. We'll see if we can do it. But one of the things that we would really like to do is to take this holistic approach to work with the whole family. And one of the reasons we want to do that is to get at the grandparents, to get at these older generations who are the sharers, who are the predominant sharers. And so we want to develop a set of resources that the kids can also take home and also can involve the whole family. So we have a very ambitious methodology for this project. We want to do in-classroom observations. We want to interview teachers after they've delivered the lessons. We want to talk to the teachers in focus groups. We want to talk to the parents in focus groups. We want to do interviews with the pupils, of course. And we want to create a baseline. So we want to understand, what do the pupils know before the intervention? What do they know directly after the intervention? And what do they know a number of weeks after? Have they actually remembered anything, right? So very, very comprehensive. We want the parents to keep diaries. What are the kids doing at home? Is this triggering new conversations? Are they getting grandparents involved? We want to do in-depth interviews with both parents and the key teachers working at the schools, and we want to round this off with a kind of mini festival at the school that involves the whole family. Right, so we're thinking about quizzes where the whole family can be involved in a quiz. We're thinking about, you know, like, are there pictures that you can bring from your grandparents? We want to try and have an as inclusive and as holistic conversation with the whole family about images. And then in the following years, we can't replicate this every single year. The idea is to come up with a methodology that still allows us to track what is happening with these kids, but with a lighter touch. So the key goal of all of this is to generate robust, rigorous data over time to actually understand what these interventions do. We don't know, because we're not measuring it and we're not critically asking these questions. Are they doing any good? Are they improving the situation? And worse still, are they maybe making things worse? Are they switching people off? And we need to ask ourselves these critical questions. And I think that one of the things that is really, really important is the urgency for this, right? So there is momentum building, but if we don't baseline this stuff, if we don't over time measure and critically measure with proper methods, then I have concerns about where we're going to end up. And this is one of the things that we would like to contribute. If you're interested in becoming involved in any way, if this is something you would like to trial through your organization or in your country, please get in touch. Thank you.